Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Liz Cook, the Vice President for Institutional Strategy and Development at the World Resources Institute, and I also serve on the board of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. We're here to discuss how WRI can help the apparel and footwear industry accelerate the adoption of sustainable business practices. This includes substantially improving the environmental footprint of brands and manufacturers, but also reimagining the design of the business model itself. This is a pivotal moment for the sector. The large scale of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the boldness of the UN Fashion Charter for Climate Action, and the growing number of individual company commitments are incredibly heartening. We're excited about this momentum, and we hope that this webinar will spark new opportunities for partnership. But first, for those of you who might be new to WRI, a bit about us. We focus on the critical issues at the intersection of environment, human well-being, and economic development. These include climate, energy, food, forest, water, the ocean, and cities. Our hallmark is to advance big, bold ideas, but to always offer practical solutions that turn these ideas into action and make economic sense. We're a global organization and we work in over 60 countries. Our 900 experts are working in many different countries, but we have offices in 7 countries, and you can see those on the yellow shaded countries on the map. Our motto is we count it, change it, scale it. And for business, this means providing measurement protocols, big data assessment tools, and multi-company collaborations where we test and scale new ways of doing business. It goes without saying that there's room for improvement in the apparel sector. Producing an average cotton shirt astonishingly requires the same amount of water as a person drinks in 2.5 years. Moreover, though, consumption trends are what really are frightening. Average consumers are buying 60% more clothing now than they did in 2000, and we're keeping them for half as long. If companies want continued growth, we need to tackle this. The apparel and footwear industry draws on many of the tools we've created for companies. My colleagues will lay out our toolbox of resources. These include science-based targets and what we're doing to drive climate ambition, scaling renewable energy in the supply chain, especially in companies where production is concentrated. This is truly a greenhouse gas hotspot as companies address implementing a science-based target. Our aqueduct tool, which helps companies assess and manage water risk. And finally, the work that we're doing with pioneering companies to test and scale e-commerce and circular business models. I just want to take a minute to thank many of you who are on the phone, on the line here, who are members of our corporate consultative group, members of our Aqueduct Alliance, donors to our apparel work, which includes the CNA Foundation, Nike, Lensing, and Target. And finally, all of you who help co-create and test our tools and strategies. Grounded research is what allows us to design solutions that are smart and that are adoptable by others. And just a quick note on housekeeping. You're all on mute and are encouraged to type your questions into our chat at any time, but we are going to wait until all of our speakers are done before we answer your questions. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Cynthia Cummins. Cynthia is the Director of our Private Sector and Climate Mitigation. She will talk about the new guidance that we've developed on setting science-based targets for the apparel sector, which we recently launched in Spain. Over to you, Cynthia.
Okay, hi everybody. So yes, I'm going to be talking about our Science-Based Targets initiative and specifically about the work we've been doing over the last 2 years to develop guidance for the apparel sector on how to set science-based targets, and also briefly discuss our next phase of work for the apparel sector. The next slide. Most of you are probably familiar with the initiative, so I'll do a very brief overview. So in 2015, the Science-Based Targets Initiative was launched along with, it's a partnership with CDP, the UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF. It's also one of the Lean Business Commitments, and we're aiming to raise the ambition of science-based target setting and make raise the ambition of target setting for the corporate sector and make science-based target setting standard practice. And we're doing this through reducing the barriers to adoption, institutionalizing the practice and key initiatives, and building the momentum on science-based target setting through a call to action campaign. Next slide. The foundation we use for science-based target setting is both the Paris Agreement and the IPCC reports, and specifically the new special report on 1.5 degrees. So the initiative was launched in the same year the Paris Agreement came out. So we use that as sort of our line of sight, or the ambition, the level of ambition that we were aiming for, which was well below 2 degrees, but also pursuing this higher level of ambition of 1.5. With the release of the 1.5 degree report from the IPCC, it provides the many new scenarios that we are now using for our science-based target setting methods. And it also provided this sense of urgency around this ultimate goal of reaching net zero by 2050. So much of our effort now is trying to see how we can support companies in this higher level of ambition of 1.5. Next slide. So while the ultimate long-term goal is net zero by 2050, we see that, that it's critical for companies to be setting these interim milestones, which are these 5 to 15-year targets that drives the shorter-term action that provides more accountability and actionability than these long-term goals. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative is efforts are generally focused around these 5 to 15-year targets. Next slide. And recently we launched new guidance for the apparel and footwear sector. So we have methods that can be applied to any kind of company, any sector in any region. We also have some sector-specific methods that work well for homogeneous companies or homogeneous sectors. But the apparel and footwear sector is quite diverse. And it's difficult to come up with a sector-specific approach that's based on a physical intensity metric. So for that reason, we didn't really think that a sector-specific method was practical or necessary. So we've focused our efforts in the guidance on trying to provide clarity on how the sector should apply the existing methods and try to provide more direction to the sector on how to set targets, and also increase consistency across companies on how they're setting targets, and identifying barriers to setting targets and achieving them that are specific to the sector, and starting to identify what those solutions are. We have a number of companies in the sector that have already set science-based targets, so we've also worked with some of those to develop some brief case studies that are in the guidance. And then we've also tried to highlight where there's already existing resources out there to support companies in the sector to achieve reductions. Next slide. So one of the things we've tried to highlight in the guidance is that for the brand, particularly the apparel and footwear brands, the majority of emissions are in their supply chain. Scope 1 and 2 emissions are relatively small, and we tried to break out the supply chain into the various tiers to clarify what those are, and then try to give some sense of the impact of those various tiers. And the emissions are slightly different if you're looking at apparel versus footwear, but generally the majority of emissions are in tier 2 and tier 4. So we're just trying to, in the guidance, try to unpack that and focus the guidance on how to set targets around the supply chain, because that's where the majority of emissions are, and where there's most challenges in addressing those emissions as well. So next slide. Oh yeah, and you can just see here why what the challenges are. So the main challenges are around influence and visibility. So for the brands looking all the way upstream, it's very tough to understand what those emissions are and getting access to primary data. And companies don't have limited influence on those emissions that are beyond their tier 1 suppliers. And then also many of those suppliers are have many customers, and so suppliers have limited influence since they're just one of many customers for these companies. Okay, next slide. So what we're trying to highlight in the guidance is just that collaboration is going to be critical to drive reductions. We think this is a great opportunity for the sector because it's a sector that historically has been able to collaborate well with each other. So around tier 1 and 2, we highlight just that there's a lot of opportunity around aggressively deploying efficiency and renewable energy in the supply chain. And then further upstream, the opportunity is around transforming the materials, around replacing materials or using more recyclable materials, activities such as those. Next slide. And then we also just briefly describe the various initiatives that are going on out there to support companies in reducing their emissions. And these activities resources go anywhere from just collecting data to measuring data, to implementing reductions, financing, and also reporting progress. So there's a wide breadth of resources out there. We just wanted to highlight those and start steering companies in the right direction for support. Next slide. So this is the progress to date with the apparel sector. We have nearly 30 companies that are either have commitments to set science-based targets or have approved targets. And you can see these are mainly brands, and we haven't had as much participation yet from these upstream suppliers that we would also like to have participating. The most recent targets that have been approved are from Puma and Burberry, and these are pretty typical for the types of targets we're seeing from the sector, where they're setting absolute reduction targets around scope 1 and 2. And then you can see here like Puma, where they're setting an economic intensity target around scope 3, which is a typical approach. And then some companies like Burberry, Levi's, and a few others have also set absolute reduction targets with just a lower level of ambition around scope 3. And for scope 1 and 2 targets, while we say they have to be aligned with a well below 2-degree pathway or go further to 1.5. For scope 3, we say the targets are ambitious and many are science-based, but we don't require that. So we have various methods that you can choose from that are ambitious, but we wouldn't say they're science-based. And one of these is this method to set an economic intensity target that we think is well suited for the apparel sector, especially for companies that are fast growing. Okay, next slide. So now with the release of the guidance, we're turning our attention to seeing how we can support companies in the sector to achieving reductions. So the next project that we're scoping out now in partnership with the Apparel Impact Institute is a SBT roadmap, which will clarify where the biggest emissions are across the value chain and get some agreement with the sector on that. And then also identify where are the biggest opportunities for reduction, what types of activity, what actions can apparel companies get to get the biggest emission reductions. And then also understanding better what resources are out there to achieve those specific reduction, including financing. And that's a piece of work we hope to launch in the next few months and complete over the next year. Next slide. And if you'd like to learn more about the initiative, you can go to sciencebasedtargets.org, and that's where we also have the Apparel guidance. It's freely available, and you can download it there. And if you have any questions about the initiative, you can contact me directly, or you can also submit your questions at info@sciencebasedtargets.org. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Just want to applaud the completion of that guidance and say that I'm fairly confident will inspire and enable more companies to set their targets, which is exactly what we want to see. And we know that roadmap is going to lead to one place in particular, which is the use of energy in the supply chain. So it's my pleasure to turn this over now to Alex Pereira, who's the Deputy Director of our Energy Program, and he's going to talk about our energy work and how it is helping apparel companies increase their use of renewable energy. Alex.
Great. Thank you very much, Liz. I did notice that both previous speakers, Liz and Cynthia, mentioned the need for collaboration. It's how we work at WRI. It's really important and a critical element to achieving the goals we all want to achieve. And so I'm going to talk about a project that really is that, an example of collaboration between WRI and other partners in industry called the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator. So the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator is again, partnership between WRI, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and a private equity firm called Allotrope Partners. The problem we were trying to solve as we were designing the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator is that, in hearing from companies operating outside of the United States in markets where they were making investments in operations, growing supply chains, building manufacturing capacity. And outside the United States, sourcing renewables is challenging. It still is challenging in many markets. And what we kept hearing from companies is, companies saying, I want to buy renewable energy. I've got increase. I'm joining RE100. I've got science-based targets. I want to increase use of renewable energy. But it's really complicated in international markets, and we just can't do it alone because the regulatory framework is blocking us. Then we talk to government partners, and government partners say, well, we want to encourage private sector investment. We want to encourage our industry, our commercial base to increase their support of renewable energy. But, we're not getting feedback from them on where we can improve our policies or where we can address some of these barriers. And then we talk to the finance community, and the bankers are all saying, boy, we've got lots and lots of money and goals and targets for investing in clean energy, but we would really like to have good credit companies, good credit off-takers in the market to de-risk some of these investments, because the traditional off-takers, the utilities, aren't very credible for us. So, boy, it'd be great if we could have more buyers, good credit commercial industrials in the marketplace to support these transactions. So we heard all these sound bites and said, there's sort of an opportunity to pull something together here and get something done. So next slide. So this chart shows the birth of the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator. And there's sort of three elements that get at exactly these components. One is, let's work with the buyers. Let's take a geographically specific conversation. So, Vietnam is an example, or Mexico is an example. I'll talk a little bit more about those later. And look at within this country, within the regulatory frameworks, within the policy frameworks in this country, what are the opportunities for buying renewables today? How do we make sure that every company understands what those opportunities are, emerging models that might be coming down the pike, and just has better capacity to understand where they can even start buying renewables today? So we're trying to bring the buyers into the clean energy market. On policy, we then provide input into policymakers. So they say, boy, we'd love to hear private sector feedback on a policy for on-site solar, for example, or a policy for using the grid to buy direct power purchase agreements. But what can we do to make this policy more workable to that sector? And so we positioned ourselves as sort of a knowledge partner for government. to give them that feedback from the private sector on where they can better align policies with private sector demand for renewable energy. And then in the pipeline piece, working with investors and financiers to bring them into the market, explore ways to aggregate projects across multiple buyers. What are the things that we can do to build a pipeline of projects to attract that financing into the marketplace? So these three components are really, we're doing this in several markets that I'll speak to, but we found it to be extremely, extremely powerful because it really brings the partnership of NGO and research institutions, the private sector, and finance, and in kind of being able to engage in a very positive, proactive way with government. And the goal of this is to create really essentially a ecosystem, a viable ecosystem for clean energy. So I'm going to speak to two examples of how we do this in both Mexico and Vietnam, just to give you an example of what this looks like. Next slide. So in Mexico, which is a market that has been flagged by many in the apparel sector as where their supply chains reach, Mexico has just gone through a shift in their regulatory framework for how companies can buy renewable energy. The new regulatory framework is, shall we say, a little more complicated, a little more technical, and companies were really struggling with understanding how they could even take advantage of this new framework. So we developed a guidebook, again, getting at that, the purchasers component. We developed a guidebook to train companies on how they can become familiar with the new regulation in Mexico for buying renewable energy. So that was very important. And then we had one company in particular that said, well, we've just set science-based targets, and we've looked at this guidebook, and we would like to do an RFP for all of our facilities across Mexico. So that is it's a really interesting initiative. So we've taken 75 retail facilities and distribution sites across Mexico. We've packaged that into a request for proposal document. So we now have an RFP document that we've developed that's sort of ready to go and can be replicated. And that RFP document has been shared with 21 renewable energy suppliers. And the idea here is that by aggregating facilities together, it allows you to access this new regulatory framework, which actually requires a minimum threshold size of consumption. But it's also a way to really get some economies of scale with the suppliers, allow more efficient financing of projects. And so this is a really interesting model that we're exploring now, and we're going to have opportunities to replicate this with other interested companies, document lessons learned, costs, best learnings from the approach of doing this, and share that widely. But it's a way to kind of get the broader private sector really familiar with innovative approaches. We're also, the second bullet is working with the Industrial Park Association. They're called AMPEEP. And so through the AMPEEP Association, we're working with 5 different industrial park managers reaching 9 industrial parks. So it's very likely that many of you on the phone have facilities that are housed in one of these industrial parks. So if you're in Mexico, you're interested in this work, there's contact information at the end, and we can explore if you have a facility that's in one of these parks and how we can plug you into this pilot. And essentially, this is where the industrial park government is very interested in finding ways to collaborate with their tenants to deploy on-site solar or bundle tenants to do off-site solar purchasing. But how do we get the industrial park managers in Mexico part of the innovation here and helping clients and their tenants source renewables? So 2 specific opportunities in Mexico that we can plug you guys into. And just on the next slide, just to go to the other side of the world, as an example, in Vietnam, where again, many of you have supply chains and manufacturing. Currently in Vietnam, you cannot buy electricity from a generator other than the utility. This is causing a lot of challenges because companies want to buy large amounts of renewables, and to date, they can only do on-site solar, which is actually very cost effective, but doesn't get the scale question that you're looking for. So we've been working with partners in Vietnam to develop a pilot program that'll be open end of the year for 300 to 400 megawatts worth of renewable energy projects to be sourced directly with buyers. And so I just want to flag this because this is a very real, very near-term opportunity that if you're interested in being part of this initial pilot, come to a workshop in August in Vietnam. We can send you more information about that because there is a process for how you would sign up to be part of this pilot that you would need to go through to be eligible to take part by the end of the year. But this is a very good opportunity for supporting a government initiative, showing support for it, making sure this program is successful and that the government then has the interest to expand this program significantly. So those are two very specific near-term opportunities. Outside of these two countries, I'll just list, so Philippines, Colombia, Indonesia, India, and China are where WRI is doing this kind of work. So I just talked about Mexico and Vietnam, but if you're interested in those other markets, let us know and we can plug you into the conversations and the projects there. Because we see that collaborating with industry, with critical sectors is an incredibly effective way at getting the policy right, exploring the transactions and the business models to make this really work, and scaling solutions that benefit all of us. So with that, the last slide, I believe, this is the last slide. So you've got the contact person, Norma Hutchinson, down there. So if you're interested in learning more about this work or any of the countries that I mentioned, email Norma and she can connect you to the right team. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Liz.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. I think it's really interesting how the commitments that companies are making to renewable energy and science-based targets is really changing, creating a dynamic in the marketplace. But I'm glad that we're offering some help to make sure that those can be implemented in a cost-effective way on the ground. In addition to energy being fundamental to production and supply chains, so is water. So happy to have our in-house water expert, Paul Reed, who's director of the aqueduct and corporate engagement in our water program here at WRI.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Liz. So just to kick it off, it's probably not news to any of you on the line today, but water risk has really emerged as something that's at the top of the global agenda. Currently ranked as really one of the highest threats to the global economy, and identifying and addressing the risks that water poses to the private sector has really proven to be extremely challenging, not just for the apparel sector, but across sectors. And that challenge stems from three things. One is water risks are very place-based. Location matters enormously, and so does context, right? So an understanding of the local issues surrounding your operational or value chain footprint is critical. Secondly, risks are multifaceted. It's not just about whether you have water or not. It can be about having too much water or too little water. It can be a risk related to the quality of the water, either as an input to your facilities or suppliers, or at the point of discharge into the environment. It can also be a risk stemming from social challenges, right, around meeting the human right to water and sanitation, or risk stemming from regulatory uncertainty because of changing regulations and policy. And in some instances, it can be geopolitical as well, particularly in parts of the world where water resources are shared between countries across borders. And then lastly, it's been really challenging as well because we don't have a scientific call to action similar to what we have for climate that drives alignment in our vision for a desired end state. So all these things have really made it hard for companies to grapple with these issues and respond effectively. And in the apparel sector, this is particularly relevant given that as an industry, you depend on water really across the full value chain. You know, starting from raw materials, right? About 57% of cotton around the world is grown in areas of water stress, where water supplies are limited. In many places around the world, cotton is irrigated, right? So it's not just dependent on the resource, but it's also contributing in part to stress and scarcity and depletion. In manufacturing, right, water quantity is a key requirement and ingredient for dyeing and finishing and washing products. And water quality as well is critical, right? Wastewater discharge and water quality impacts are an extremely material issue in many hotspots for the apparel industry around the world. And then lastly, reputation and regulation is also something that threatens your supply chains, right? We've heard many instances where the human right to water has been violated in supply chains in the apparel industry, and it's been tied back to brands. And regulatory uncertainty is huge as under-regulated markets start increasing pressure on users around how they can manage and discharge water. So really relevant for manufacturing as well as raw materials, but we shouldn't forget also about consumer product use, right? Once your products go into markets, your users need to maintain and wash those products over time, a process that requires both energy and water. But in the case of water, it is one of the places of the value chain where a lot of the consumption and withdrawals take place. So extremely relevant across the full value chain. And here at WRI, we help all companies, but specifically in the case of the apparel industry, we work to help measure and quantify these risks and also opportunities across the full value chain, looking at consumer markets, manufacturing operations, and supply chains. And then we work very closely with companies, either individually or through collaborations, to develop strategies, stewardship strategies, and targets that help drive long-term value to the company by reducing risk and ensuring business continuity and business growth. And central to this value proposition is our Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas tool, an open source geospatial tool to help measure and screen for environmental externalities related to water. And I wanted to use the time today to update you on the Aqueduct tool. We're a few weeks out from launching an updated version of the tool, scheduled currently for launch August 6th. So I wanted to spend some time talking through what the update looks like so you have a sense of what's coming. Go to the next slide. So I think it's important to take a step back and explain how we see the Aqueduct tool kind of holistically from WRI's perspective, right? It's not just an application on your browser. There's a lot more to it. We've built the tool and are updating it as a central data repository on water risk information that has global coverage. So you could think of it as this massive database of information that you can then access in multiple ways. You can use the Aqueduct tools, which you could think of as applications on your browser, all of which are open source, and you can do analysis and access the data via the internet. But you can also download the data directly, right, from WRI servers and incorporate it into your own systems, your own analysis in-house, or you can access the data via APIs and build your applications or incorporate the data directly into your systems, right, which is something we're seeing increasingly as well. So we're really about making the data as accessible as possible to the markets, and we do that through this approach that allows for multiple entry points to the information. Next one. So this is a screenshot of what the updated tool is going to look like. The functionalities are extremely similar, if not the same, to what's currently available. Given the multi-dimensional kind of aspect of water risk, we use many different indicators to measure these different dimensions of risk: quantity, quality, regulatory, reputational risk. and allow users to look at these indicators individually or to aggregate them into composite indices. And if you do want to use a composite index, you can then weight indicators based on their relative importance to you as an organization or to your sector. So that hasn't changed. The design has changed a little bit, and then most importantly, what's changed is the data underpinning the tool and what is most important for the users. Specifically, the two things that have changed or will be changed with this new version of the tool is the indicators underpinning the water risk framework, which basically refers to the data, and then the hydrological model underneath them, right? So these are the two major updates, and I'm going to walk through why these are important to you. Next slide. So in terms of the indicators, as I said, we use a framework of 13 different indicators that can be aggregated into these composite scores. You can come up with a composite score for physical risk related to water quantity, physical risk related to water quality, and then regulatory and reputational risks. And then you can further aggregate those into a composite index called overall water risk, which would include all of the indicators below it. And what we've done after probably about 5 years of working with companies is we have been able to really understand which indicators provide most value that we currently offer and maintain those and improve them with updates to the data. And then we've been able to remove some indicators that weren't very useful and add others, right, that we felt were missing. So specifically, we're talking about an update of 7 new indicators to the framework. One is called baseline water depletion, which looks at the impact that users have on the resource, how much of the resource is being depleted. An indicator on groundwater table decline. This is very new and something that has been missing, an insight into the state of the groundwater resource in every region. An indicator of coastal flood risk, right? Increasingly important to organizations that have assets or suppliers along the coastline. And 2 indicators of water quality, untreated connected wastewater at a national level, and then coastal eutrophication potential, which is a measure of non-point source pollution. And then 2 new indicators for regulatory and reputational risk. One around looking at the rate of unimproved or no access to sanitation and hygiene by local communities, and the other one called the Peak Rep Risk Index, which is built on a proprietary database of regulatory and reputational risk to the private sector. So those are the main updates. All of the data includes also much more recent information using the most recent data available. Go to the next one, which we've been able to obtain from an updated hydrological model. We're moving from a model that was run by NASA to one that's run out of Utrecht University in the Netherlands, with whom we have a partnership with. And the main features of this updated model and why it's exciting, definitely to the water nerds, hopefully to others as well, is the estimates of water supply for the first time include an account for both surface and groundwater resources. It used to be just surface water resources. This is a massive update in how we compute stress, and something that I think is going to be really useful. Supply and demand are computed together, right? In order to understand the demand and how much of that is met, you need to understand the supply in combination to it. Much higher spatial resolution, moving from about 100 by 100 kilometer grids to 10 by 10 kilometer grids. So major update there. More recent information and higher temporal resolution. We have monthly data for a number of the indicators. And then lastly, we use a much more, widely adopted hydrological subbasin delineation. So anyway, you can see here, not getting into too much into the technical aspect, but a lot of things that are going to make this product much more robust and valuable to the end user. So why is this important to you? Why should you care? The main reason is because if you've been using the tool in the past to assess exposure to risk and screen for water-related externalities, the results of those screenings and risk assessments might change using this tool, or maybe not. We don't know. It's going to depend on your geographic footprint and the distribution of the assets you've been looking at. Some places are going to see changes and others are not. And what's important to keep in mind is that these changes could be driven by any one of those factors I mentioned in the updates, right? It could be related to the update in the time scale, or it could be related to the change in indicator, to the method. Before jumping to conclusions, right, it's really important that users conduct kind of in-depth analysis of the local context and the areas of interest to evaluate what's driving that change and what type of action is warranted in response to that change. So that's important to keep in mind. Then just to wrap up, I spoke mostly about the Aqueduct tool, but as I mentioned earlier, we work a lot on applying the tool with companies and informing strategies, target setting, and also doing a number of open source kind of thought leadership projects in collaboration with multiple companies. There's a link that includes a description of all of that work if you're interested. And just to flag some of the companies in your sector that we've worked with, we work a lot with Cargill. They have an important role in the cotton industry, and then we've done work with Eileen Fisher and Nike and DF Corporation as it relates to risk assessment and strategy development.
Terrific. Well, thank you.
Yep.
Really important work, exciting that 3.0 is about to be given birth to.
Yep.
See the light of day. It's been a long time in the works, and we really do want folks to use it so that we can help you improve your water management risk assessment. So stepping back, that was all about footprint and impact in the supply chain. Stepping back, I'm going to turn it over to Elliot. He's really going to talk about some of the bigger picture work that we're doing. I'm really excited because it does get at the heart of the challenges around consumption. WRI doesn't do a lot of work in that area. We're doing more, and this is one of the spaces that we're doing it in. So Elliot, Director of Sustainable Business and Innovation, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Liz. Yeah, so Liz mentioned up front the consumption trends in the sector, and this is something WRI picked up on initially back in 2002. We had a paper come out called Tomorrow's Markets, and if you look in that old report, you'll find 2 pages on consumption. And we took a look at that a couple years ago. We thought, why hasn't this been picked up? Why is this being ignored? Had some private conversations with companies, much like Alex was talking about with energy. With WRI is really good at listening, and we heard a lot of companies saying, look, we are not able to make the consumption conversation stick internally. There's no one's willing to pay attention to us. Those on the sustainability team were sort of explaining that business models weren't set up for them to meet some of these ambitious sustainability goals if they're still going to sell more stuff to more people. So we ended up doing a paper on this 2 years ago. If you go to the next slide, please. We called it the elephant in the boardroom, and it got a lot of really good conversations started. I think there's a lot of companies that were waiting for something like this that they could use internally to spark dialogue with their board, with their executives, et cetera. And in that paper, there's a section on apparel. And a number of apparel companies came up and said, look, this is exactly what we're working on right now. We're looking at circular economy business models. Is that going to be a way for us to grow without simply selling more stuff to more people? So if you go to the next slide, please. I mean, this is a sector, obviously, it's under a lot of pressure. This is a look at how much of Americans' paychecks are being spent on clothes. So a declining amount of our income is being spent on clothes, so the prices are going down. You imagine the number of clothes are going down too. But if you click through the next image here, actually we're buying a lot more clothes. And so this is the fast fashion trend you might be familiar with, right? So it's cheaper clothes more often. If you go to the next slide, this is reflected in the cycles that we're seeing. And there's more stuff going on to the shelves and the hangers every day. Cheaper clothes, more affordable. People are able to go in, buy new styles, et cetera. A lot of pressure on the sector right now. And this is, mostly in the US here, but we looked at some other markets, and imagine some of these fast emerging economies, places like India, Mexico, et cetera, China. I mean, these are consumers that are getting to the point where they have income to spend more on apparel. And so these trends, if they start to get picked up there, then we're in big trouble. So you go to the next slide. What we opted to do was have some, again, conversations with these companies that came out after we released the elephant in the boardroom, and talk to them about what's preventing them from really going deeper into the circular economy and scaling some of these models. They gave us a lot of good insights around, we need to be sure that the customers are ready for this. We need to have some common ways of measuring the impact of our new business models. Is this really going to help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Is it going to help us with our water footprint? Is it going to reduce energy use in our, overall footprint? And then what are the policies that they're going to need to really scale this? Fortunately, we teamed with some really good organizations. You might be familiar with the group WRAP in the UK, who's been working on fashion and apparel for a number of years now. They actually have the best resources on this. So we partnered with them, and then we got a lot of great support from the CNA Foundation. And they have a Bridging the Gap initiative, they call it, which is essentially pushing and supporting organizations that are making the leap towards a circular economy on the ground, implementing these business models, testing and learning. And the picture here, if you look closely, this is really interesting. This is I won't say whose retail outlet this is. It's in Washington, D.C. It's not far from WRI's offices. But we walk by this and we notice, if you look really closely there on the left, it's got some language there about circular economy. It says, let's close the loop on fashion. It talks a little about the impact that they're trying to have with the circular economy business models. But then you look on the other side, you look up to the right there, it says new stuff's coming in every day. So why don't you do the same? So you have this tension, this real tension that companies are dealing with, fast fashion on the one hand, and then this push for the circular economy on the other. And how do you square that circle? So if you go to the next slide, please. This is part of the work. This is a preview. This is early draft, but we've started tapping into, again, with our partners at WRAP, tapping into some of these markets, understanding, are customers ready for these business models? Things like Rent the Runway are starting to get attention in the US, but what about in the UK? What about India? We were really impressed to see that more than half of the customers surveyed were interested in at least one of the circular economy business models. They don't necessarily want to go and buy stuff, then throw it away. That's not what the service they're looking for. They want, new fashion. They want to express themselves with apparel and footwear. And, especially in India, it was fascinating to see the results come back from India. Now, there's some caveats here and some different things that we can talk about, the assumptions and some of the survey data limitations, but really interesting early results. Go to the next slide, please. The other thing that's in the works now and actually is about to go into review and a road testing phase is a guidance document. Essentially, this fills the gap. There is no existing guidance on how would you measure the impact of a rental business model compared to a linear business model. What can you communicate to your customers, stakeholders, et cetera, that your company has X impact on its greenhouse gases? Now, there's, again, limitations here on how much you can actually claim credibly, but we're going to try and give some fair assumptions and some guidance on how you can do that in a way that's at least credible estimate. Both on the environmental side and, importantly, on the social side too. Will the circular economy work for people? There's a lot of big questions there, and my colleague Deborah Drew is leading some really interesting work on that topic, and you might have seen her publish some blogs on the topic, and she's someone worth following. Anyways, next slide, please. The last piece is something that we're also really intrigued by, which is how do you shape the rules so that instead of facing an uphill battle when you're testing a circular business model, you actually have support. So if you click through a little bit here, you'll see that we're talking about trying to level the playing field. Right now, if you're looking at circular business models, you face a lot of barriers. Things that have to do with how you transport used goods across borders, waste definitions, even things like accounting principles. We found that there are some accounting principles that were set up for a linear system that just don't work for a circular system. So that the playing field sort of tilted towards a linear model. If you click through the next couple slides, you'll see that what we want to do is we want to start tilting things back towards a circular model and finding some of these enabling policies. And my colleague Liz Reichart has done a scan of the landscape of policies, and we're going to produce a couple different products here soon. In fact, if you click one more through it, there's an opportunity for anybody on the line who wants to participate. We're gathering input. If you've seen some of these policies that either enable or block circular economy business models, let us know. That link right there will take you to 2 or 3 questions that you can provide your input. So look out for that stuff. Really exciting work. I've been at WRI for 12 years now, and this is one of the more exciting topics we've taken on. Welcome input, welcome more conversations. If this is something you're trying to tackle as well, welcome your partnership.
Thanks, Ellie, and I can say that when I've had the opportunity to present this work within the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, I've had a number of companies say that they're really excited and interested in getting involved in this. So you're starting to make some change happen and enable that change. So to put a virtual bow around these multiple projects that we're doing at WRI, I'm going to hand it over to Emily Nagel, who is the Corporate Relations and Communications Manager. She also runs our Corporate Consultative Group, which is a membership program. And then we have gotten a few questions. She'll kind of go through some of those. I think we'll be able to cover them in the time that we have left. So turn it over to you.
I think we will. Thanks, Liz, and thanks to our speakers. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily Nagel, and as you've heard, WRI's experts are developing all sorts of tools and research, data, guidance, collaborations, and I hope that after what you've heard today, you agree that these are valuable resources for corporate sustainability professionals and business leaders. So I just want to take a moment here to let you know that if you want to continue this conversation, WRI's corporate relations team can help, and specifically how the CCG, Corporate Consultative Group, can do that. So the CCG is a great place to start when you want to work with WRI on integrated and cross-cutting projects, and to do so with the support of a dedicated relationship manager. So we work with you to really understand your objectives and to customize and tailor how we can connect you with these resources. The slide here shows a couple of examples of CCG member benefits. They fall in roughly 2 buckets. Some are consistent for all members. It's things like our virtual events and our curated business newsletter, while others are tailored to each member company's specific needs and priorities. So for example, we work with companies on their target setting or on executive briefings on key issues. We can provide peer review if you're issuing a white paper or working through any technical documents, and on and on. So we'd love to continue that discussion with your company, but don't just take my word for it about how we can help. Here on the slide, you'll see our current roster of members, and it's a wide range of sectors, known leaders and brands who you probably have peers across these companies. Many of them are working hard to raise ambition, and some of them have been with us since the beginning of the CCG more than 10 years ago. So working with these companies to provide input and road testing and collaborations and feedback. And if this is a space that you'd like to stretch into, we'd love to talk about how to bring you into this roster as well. So like I said, I look forward to speaking with any of you, not if you're interested in working not just in one area, but if you'd like to work on a real cross-cutting host of programmatic areas and how to improve the apparel sector impact. So with that though, I'll stop on the CCG and we'll jump to questions. There are a few in the chat here, Alex. I'll start with, I'm going to read 2 for you and see if maybe you can bundle the answer here.
Sure.
So we have one here that's around countries set for CEIA. So most of the raw materials coming from Taiwan or China, and so our countries set for that. And then the other here was saying, thank you for the comments, examples from Mexico and Vietnam. Do we have any plans for activities that focus on the Congo Basin and those related countries?
Yep, thank you for the questions. We currently do not have plans to bring the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator work to the Congo Basin countries. But we are always open, and if we see demand, if there's sort of hotspots of demand from companies and enough partners that are interested in making this work happen, you know, it's always something we can explore, but we currently do not have plans to take this work to that area. As for China and Taiwan, we do have a team in Beijing. They are interested in looking at the supply chain angle, working at the provincial level to support direct power purchase agreement pilots. So if you're interested in work in China, we can connect you into the team in Beijing and you can follow up on those conversations. But there is some of this type of work going on in China.
Excellent, thanks, Alex. Cynthia, I'm going to scroll up to the top here from the beginning, your portion on apparel sector guidance for science-based targets. I know you typed an answer into the chat, but for the benefit of everyone on the line, the question was looking a little bit more around the idea of setting an SBT by region. Can you speak a bit to the dynamic between regional context setting and also kind of how multinational companies work?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So right now our scenarios integrated into our target setting methods are all using global scenarios, and we think that's best suited for the private sector, especially multinationals that are operating in many different regions. We do see some benefit of having a regional approach for power generation, since there's not a lot of cross-border activity, like things are confined within a region. So we are exploring a regional approach for power generation. And that could potentially be used by companies to set their scope 2 component of their targets by region. That's something we'll explore further down the line, but we don't currently plan to expand that to other sectors at this point, a regional approach.
Thank you, Cynthia. You know, I think we might have time for one more, and it's a follow-up on science-based targets. Cynthia, you mentioned economic intensity targets. Could you clarify a bit about that, and why is that a better target for the apparel industry?
So the economic intensity target is a target that allows a company to set on an intensity basis, so it's emissions per some economic output, so it's denominator, like so dollar revenue, dollar value added. And it works particularly well for the apparel sector since it is a fast growing sector, and it does, so it doesn't constrain growth the way an absolute reduction target would. You still have to set quite an ambitious target. It would be a minimum of a 7% on an annual basis reduction on an economic intensity basis, but that is less difficult generally for fast-growing companies than setting an absolute reduction target. And we only allow that for scope 3 target setting. If you were setting that around scope 1 and 2 emissions, we would say that target has to translate to an absolute reduction target in line with a well below 2-degree pathway. And we would calculate that based on a company's expected growth rate.
Okay, in the interest of time, having been met and not wanting to keep people past your main, well, for some of you lunch hour, it's not lunch hour everywhere. We're going to wrap this up. There was a question about have we recorded this, and the answer to that is yes. And we will send it to all of you, a link to that to all of you who have RSVP that you will be on the call, whether you made it or not, to the webinar. But we will also post it online at www.WRI.org. And there is an events page on our homepage where you will be able to find the link to the recording. Please know that everyone's name up there. We have emails and ways to contact people on our website as well. So if you have some follow-up questions, I see 1 or 2 more had come in on a more very specific technical basis, you can contact any of the people who have spoken, including myself. So thank you again for your time. Go off to the rest of your day and have a productive day. And we look forward to connecting with you in the future.